She found out about the affair, but she didn't make a scene. She put on an exhibition that no one will forget. Subscribe so you don't miss the new stuff, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun filtered softly through the linen curtains of the Bennett household, casting warm stripes of gold across the oak floorboards of the master bedroom. Lauren Bennett awoke to the familiar scent of cedar from the bedside candle that had long since burned out, its lingering fragrance a comfort she barely registered anymore. She rolled onto her side and glanced at the man lying beside her. Ethan's breathing was slow and steady, his face half buried in the pillow, one arm thrown casually over the duvet. He looked peaceful, untroubled, as always. Lauren lay there for a moment longer, studying him as she had countless times over their 16-year marriage. She remembered when simply watching him sleep filled her with wonder, but now that wonder had faded into something quieter, more observational. She had once photographed him like this: soft morning light, half-shadowed angles of his cheekbone, the vulnerable curve of his shoulder. That photo had won her a regional award. She hadn't taken his picture in years. Down the hallway, the distinct shuffle of teenage footsteps could be heard, followed by the muffled slam of a bathroom door. Their daughter Ella, 14 and already too sophisticated for her age, had developed a habit of waking early to spend more time on her appearance than school itself. Lauren smiled faintly and sat up, brushing her dark hair back. Despite her 41 years, the silver strands remained elusive, and her skin, though lined, bore the care of a disciplined lifestyle. She stretched, savoring the momentary quiet before the day consumed her. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with the gentle chaos of morning. Zachary, 11 and perpetually lost in some fantastical world of his own making, munched cereal while scrolling through a tablet. The dog, Luna, a gentle golden retriever, circled the table, nudging for toast crusts. Lauren moved through it all like a practiced conductor, distributing lunches, reminders, and kisses with ease. It was a rhythm she knew by heart. Ethan entered the kitchen in a crisp button-down shirt, freshly shaven, smelling faintly of bergamot and expensive cologne. He kissed her cheek absently, the way someone might tap a light switch, automatic and devoid of intention. "Morning," he said, grabbing a travel mug and pouring himself coffee. "Big day?" Lauren nodded as she zipped Zach's backpack. "Meeting with the gallery director. They've offered me a solo exhibit." He paused, momentarily interested. "Really? That's great." His enthusiasm lasted exactly one sip of coffee before he was glancing at his phone. She watched him scroll, his thumb hovering for a beat too long over a notification before he flicked it away and returned the device to his pocket. A flicker of something passed through her. Curiosity? Suspicion? She wasn't sure, but it faded just as quickly. Later that morning, after dropping the kids at school and walking Luna through their quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Queen Anne, Lauren arrived at her studio. The space was sunlit and full of controlled disarray. Canvases leaned against walls, rolls of backdrops coiled like resting animals, shelves of books and negatives, cameras charging like sleeping soldiers. It was her sanctuary, the only place where the noise of the world flattened into clarity. The meeting with the gallery director went smoothly. They were offering her a prime spot at the Cascadia Modern in early summer. The theme was open-ended, but they were interested in something personal. The curator had hinted that her past work, particularly the Silent Women series, had resonated because it was vulnerable, human, and unafraid to dwell in discomfort. Lauren returned to her studio full of ideas. As she sat at her desk, flipping through sketches and contact sheets, the theme began to take shape. Family. Not just hers, but families of all forms, blended, strained, joyful, fractured, real families. The ones behind the Christmas cards and matching sweaters. She would call it Family Portrait. She envisioned photographing her closest friends, her neighbors, even former students with children of their own, and yes, her own family. The Bennetts had always been viewed as idyllic. Two professionals, charming children, community involvement, vacations in the San Juans. They were, as Ethan had joked once, the Instagram family. That evening, over dinner, she shared the concept with Ethan and the kids. Ella gave a noncommittal shrug, her teenage indifference armor against sincerity. Zach was more enthusiastic, asking if Luna could be in the pictures. Ethan smiled, raised his glass of wine, and offered a polite, "Sounds like a beautiful idea." But he was distracted. His phone buzzed twice under the table. He didn't check it immediately, which struck Lauren as odd. Ethan always checked. She reminded herself not to read too much into it. Over the next few days, she began scheduling shoots. She contacted the families she wanted to include, scouted locations, sketched compositions in her notebook. In a moment of sentimentality, she pulled out their wedding album from the attic, flipping through its pages with bittersweet reverence. There they were, two idealists in their late 20s, smiling with unfiltered joy beneath the banyan trees of Maui. So much had changed, yet the essence, their story, had felt unshakable. Until recently. The signs were subtle at first. Ethan began working later hours, citing meetings and supplier delays. On weekends, he would step outside to take a quick call and return visibly subdued. He'd started using a different scent, something heavier, more assertive than his usual citrus notes. When she asked about it, he joked that he'd grabbed the wrong bottle at the store. It wasn't the first time Lauren had sensed a change, but she'd always been careful not to leap to conclusions. They had weathered much together. 2 miscarriages, Ethan's early career failures, her mother's sudden death. Each storm had left a mark, but they had emerged, if not stronger, then at least united in their survival. Trust, she believed, was a living organism. It had to be nurtured, watered with honesty and space. She had prided herself on giving Ethan that space, even when it ached. Now she began to wonder if space had become absence. Samantha Monroe had been a friend for years. She had a laugh that made people turn their heads, an instinct for social charm, and a magnetic ease that put everyone at comfort. She had met Ethan through Lauren and later joined his restaurant team to manage branding and media. She was single, stylish, and as far as Lauren knew, disinterested in domestic life. They texted often. At first, Lauren had found it reassuring. It meant the restaurant was thriving. It meant trust. But recently, Samantha's name appeared on Ethan's phone more frequently, and not always at work-appropriate hours. Still, Lauren said nothing. When she scheduled the weekend retreat at the lake house, it was partly for the project, and partly because she wanted to feel them all together again. She invited close friends, including Samantha, under the pretense of gathering stories and images. Ethan had hesitated, saying he had obligations, but ultimately agreed. On the drive up, with the kids squabbling in the back seat and Ethan silent at the wheel, Lauren gazed out at the pine-draped highway and tried to breathe through the tension sitting in her chest like a coiled animal. She told herself she was imagining it, that they were simply tired, that things would feel better surrounded by laughter, wine, and nature. But the unease didn't leave her. It followed her like a whisper she could not decipher, lingering in glances, in the pauses between words, in the space Ethan left between them when he slid into bed without touching her. In moments like these, Lauren turned to her camera. It had always been her shield and her truth. Through the lens, she could see what others missed. She could control the frame. She could make sense of the world, even when her heart trembled. And now, with the lake weekend ahead and her camera packed, she hoped to capture something real, something that would remind her what family meant, even if, deep down, she feared what the lens might reveal. The lake house stood at the edge of a forest where cedar trees stretched tall and ancient along the northern curve of Lake Crescent. It was the kind of place that belonged to a simpler time. All weathered wood, screened porches, and the slow creak of rocking chairs that had endured more seasons than people. Lauren had always loved this house. It had belonged to Ethan's grandparents, and when they passed, it had come to them, a rare gift that neither sold nor rented, reserved for solitude, escape, and the occasional retreat with close friends. They arrived on a cool Friday afternoon, the sky heavy with pre-autumn haze and the smell of damp pine rising from the forest floor. Zach leapt from the car before it had fully stopped, already chasing Luna down the hill toward the dock. Ella emerged next, earbuds in, her face fixed in a practiced expression of teenage disinterest. Ethan stepped out slowly, stretching as he glanced at the lake, his phone still in his hand, thumb brushing its glass face like a nervous habit. Lauren lingered behind, watching them all from the driveway. The wind pulled softly at her scarf, and for a moment she felt the old comfort this place had always offered. It was peaceful here, removed. The lake didn't care about failing marriages or suspicious glances. It just was. Inside, the house was much as they'd left it last season, musty but familiar. Lauren opened the windows, letting in the clean air. She moved through the rooms, dusting off surfaces, unfolding the memories hidden in quilts, family board games, and picture frames. In the master bedroom, she noticed the photograph she had taken a decade earlier still hanging above the bed. It showed Ethan lifting Ella, then a toddler, high into the air, both their faces alight with laughter. She studied the image. Something about it now felt foreign, like a dream remembered from another lifetime. By early evening, the house had filled with voices. Samantha arrived with a bottle of wine and an oversized sweater that fell artfully off one shoulder. She hugged Lauren warmly, complimented her new haircut, and moved with easy familiarity through the kitchen, as if it were her own. Behind her came Mark and Janine with their toddler twins, followed shortly by Ethan's sister Kara and her partner Michael. The group settled quickly into a rhythm of chopping vegetables, opening drinks, sharing stories. Laughter rang through the rafters, and for a while it felt genuine. Lauren brought out her camera only briefly that night, catching a few candid shots as people cooked and talked. She was careful not to intrude. This part of the project would come later, once the atmosphere had mellowed and the moments turned unguarded. She had learned that the best images weren't taken. They revealed themselves when the subject forgot they were being seen. The next day was golden and cool, with mist rising from the lake in tendrils like breath. After breakfast, Lauren proposed a photo session down by the water. The families gathered willingly, arranging themselves on the dock and in the shallows. She clicked away quietly, offering little direction, letting the natural dynamics unfold. Parents reached for children, couples touched arms or brushed hair from faces. The photos were soft, warm, real. Then came her own family's turn. Lauren set the tripod, adjusted the timer, and stood between Ethan and the kids. She smiled because she knew she had to. But when she looked at the resulting image later, her own eyes seemed flat, glassy. Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Ella leaned away from him just slightly. Zach, as always, was the only one truly present. That evening, while the others played charades in the living room, Lauren sat alone in her upstairs studio space, uploading the photos to her laptop. The whir of the hard drive and the soft patter of rain on the roof were her only companions. She sipped tea and began sorting through the files. She paused on one image, Samantha laughing with Ethan in the background, his eyes fixed on her just a moment too long. In another, they stood side by side, shoulders brushing, hands barely apart. The angles were innocent to an outsider, but Lauren was not an outsider. She knew Ethan's expressions, the subtle tilt of his smile when he was enchanted, the way he leaned in slightly when trying to impress. She told herself not to jump to conclusions. People touched, people smiled, but even as she reasoned, her stomach clenched with something more instinctive. On Sunday afternoon, while the others hiked a nearby trail, Lauren stayed behind to photograph the house in its natural quiet. She wandered through rooms with her camera, capturing sunlight on dust motes, shadows curling around old books, a child's shoe kicked under the bench. She paused outside the guest room where Samantha was staying and hesitated. The door was ajar. Inside, a scarf, Ethan's favorite brand, was draped over a chair. She didn't remember him wearing it this weekend. She stepped away. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and most guests had retired, Lauren sat on the porch, camera in her lap. She stared out at the lake, the water black and still, reflecting stars. Ethan joined her, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was about business, how the new wine supplier was overcharging, how Samantha was helping negotiate better contracts. Lauren nodded, silent. She noticed how often he mentioned Samantha these days. Every story seemed to involve her. Back in the studio the following week, she reviewed the full set of photos from the lake. Frame by frame, she began to see a pattern. Samantha always near Ethan. Ethan always oriented toward her, even when others weren't. A private glance here, a shared laugh there. In a shot taken through the window from outside, Lauren captured them in the kitchen, seemingly mid-conversation, Samantha's hand resting on Ethan's forearm. He wasn't pulling away. The most damning moment came from the drone footage. She had used it to capture sweeping shots of the lake and house. One of the videos, set on a slow automatic pan, had recorded a 20-minute stretch of the back garden. Most of it was uneventful. Trees swaying, a bird landing on the railing. But at minute 13, Lauren watched as Ethan and Samantha peered beneath the trees, just outside the range of the house. They were talking. Close. His hand touched her waist. She leaned in. Then they kissed. Briefly, softly, but undeniably. Lauren's heart thudded so loud in her ears she almost couldn't hear the rest. She paused the video, backed it up, played it again. She closed the file, reopened it. There was no mistaking it. She didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. Instead, she sat back in her chair and let the silence wash over her. For a long time, she didn't move. She could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the hum of the computer. Outside, city traffic moved in invisible waves. Her hands trembled slightly, resting on the armrests like birds ready to flee. She felt betrayed, and foolish, and furious. But above all, she felt clarity, a piercing, undeniable clarity that she hadn't felt in years. The kind of clarity that came from seeing the truth laid bare, Not through accusation or confrontation, but through evidence. Through the lens. The same lens she had trusted since she was 16 and had borrowed her father's Pentax for the first time. In the days that followed, Lauren moved through her life with a strange detachment. She went to class, taught her students, made dinner, helped with homework. Ethan continued as if nothing had changed, still smiling, still distracted, still leaving early and returning late. When Samantha's name came up in conversation, Lauren merely nodded, storing each word, each detail. She began to dream in photographs. In one dream, she stood in a white gallery, walls covered in black and white prints of Ethan and Samantha, their betrayal frozen in time. Visitors walked slowly, heads tilted, murmuring in awe. In another, she was back at the lake, holding her camera like a weapon, and no one noticed her. She was invisible, floating just outside the frame. One afternoon, while the house was empty, Lauren retrieved the hard drive containing the lake photos and videos. She labeled a folder the frame. Into it, she dragged the most telling images: the glance, the touch, the kiss. She then opened a blank notebook and began to sketch. Not faces, but layouts, narratives, concepts. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew the gallery exhibit would change. It wouldn't just be about families. It would be about the truth behind them. The curated myth and the hidden fractures, the polished Christmas cards and the silent decay beneath them. And she would start with her own. The day after Lauren watched the video, she didn't pick up her camera. She didn't step into her studio, didn't answer emails from the gallery or her students. She moved through the house like a visitor, pausing in doorways, staring at objects that had once been invisible in their familiarity. Framed family portraits, a ceramic mug from their 10th anniversary trip to Big Sur, the quilt Ethan's mother had sewn the Christmas after Ella was born. Each artifact seemed like part of a set design, chosen for a role they no longer served. Her life, she realized, had become a museum of what used to be true. Ethan left early that morning, claiming a supplier meeting and a working lunch. He kissed her on the cheek as usual, mumbled something about being home late, and disappeared into the crisp morning without noticing the way she was watching him. Not a flicker of guilt on his face. Not even hesitation. That, more than anything, told her how deeply embedded the lie had become in him, how comfortable he had grown inside it. She waited until the house was empty before she returned to the studio. The images on her monitor glared at her like accusations. She clicked through them slowly, one by one. The moment in the garden, the hand on Samantha's waist, the smile, the kiss. It wasn't even passionate, just soft, familiar. A kiss exchanged not with hunger, but with routine. That was what undid her. Not the act, but the ease. This had happened before. This wasn't spontaneous or accidental. This was practiced. She moved to the audio settings, turned the volume up. Their conversation was barely audible, the wind scraping most of it away, but she caught fragments. Samantha laughed at something. Ethan said her name. The kiss was silent. Lauren shut the laptop and stepped back. Later that afternoon, when the children returned from school, she sat with them at the kitchen island, helping with homework and slicing apples, pretending. The pretense came easily. She'd always been good at it. Smile for the camera, smile for the kids, smile for the friends. The woman who held everything together, who made things look seamless. Her whole career, in a way, had been built on capturing the image of what people wanted to believe. Now, for the first time, she would do the opposite. She would show what lay beneath. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Lauren opened Ethan's laptop. He had never been protective of it. His password hadn't changed in years, their wedding date. A gesture that once seemed romantic now felt like a cruel joke. She didn't know what she was looking for at first, but it didn't take long to find it. There were emails, hundreds of them, between Ethan and Samantha, filed neatly under a business folder buried among invoices and inventory logs. She opened one, dated 6 months ago. Subject, dinner next Friday. Samantha had written, Arya at 8, private booth. I'll wear the red one you like. Lauren's stomach clenched. She opened another. This one included photos, a selfie of the two of them, cheek to cheek, wine glasses in hand, Ethan's arm around her waist. Samantha's lips pursed in mock surprise. It was captioned, Too bad your business trip ends tomorrow. I'll miss my favorite co-conspirator. There were more. Dozens of exchanges, some playful, some intimate, some painfully mundane. They talked about meetings, recipes, vacation ideas. They joked about Lauren's photography exhibit, calling it domestic propaganda. They imagined what it would be like to live together in a different city, Portland or Santa Fe. They mentioned Ella and Zach only in passing. In one message, Samantha had written, You think she suspects? Ethan had replied, She trusts me too much. That's the problem. Lauren stopped reading. She sat still for a long time, hands resting on the edge of the desk, absorbing the weight of those words. That's the problem. Not the betrayal itself, not the risk, but her trust. Her love had become an obstacle to their indulgence. The next morning, she stood in the shower with the water running cold, staring at the tiled wall. She thought of the woman she had been a week ago, and how little that woman knew. She thought of how often she had brushed away her instincts, how many signs she had ignored in the name of peace. How often she had explained away Ethan's distance, his absences, his shifting mood. She had told herself he was stressed, tired, overworked. She had blamed herself sometimes for not being more available, more spontaneous, more forgiving. Now, she felt something else rising in her chest. Not grief, not even anger. Something sharper, clean, focused. She would not scream. She would not weep into her pillow. She would not confront him in a scene designed to elicit guilt or excuses. She had seen enough to know he would deny what he could, minimize what he couldn't, and reframe the rest as a misunderstanding. No, she would do something different. She returned to her studio and reopened the folder she had begun, the frame. She added the most damning images. She created subfolders, touch, glance, silence, fantasy, each image carefully labeled. She began printing them on archival paper, large format, unedited. The truth needed no softening. She called the gallery and told the curator she was modifying her concept. The exhibit would still be titled Family Portrait, but she wanted to push the idea further, explore what family meant behind the lens. The curator was intrigued. She spoke of tension, narrative, contrast. Lauren nodded through the conversation, promising to deliver a revised proposal within the week. At night, she started sleeping in the guest room. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. Maybe he thought it was temporary. Maybe he was relieved. Maybe he didn't care. 3 days after the discovery, she found herself standing in front of a boutique hotel on the waterfront. Inside, she requested a corner suite with large windows. She gave her name for the reservation. She would not sleep under the same roof with a man who had turned their marriage into theater. She went to the restaurant Arya on impulse. It was the same one mentioned in Samantha's email. She asked to speak with the maitre d'. She introduced herself as Lauren Bennett, and requested a reservation for the following Friday night. A table for two, preferably near the private booths. She mentioned it was a business dinner. The maitre d' nodded, accustomed to discretion, and made a note in the ledger. Back in her studio, Lauren drafted a letter. Not to Ethan. Not to Samantha. To Daniel Monroe, Samantha's husband. They had met a few times at events, exchanged pleasantries, discussed architecture and education. She wrote formally, as a professor reaching out to a respected professional. She was curating a lecture series for her graduate students, she explained, and admired his innovative work in sustainable design. She proposed a meeting to discuss his possible participation. She had a reservation at Aria that Friday, if he was available. She mailed the letter, then sat at her desk staring at the space where it had been. Her hands felt strangely steady. The plan was taking shape. Not out of vengeance, not even justice, but something more primal, the need to restore balance, to show them and herself that she was not invisible, that she would not be quietly erased. The next few days passed in a trance of logistics. She created mock-ups of the exhibit. She edited captions, refined layouts, calculated sightlines. The images of Ethan and Samantha were integrated discreetly into the broader narrative, framed in such a way that their truth would unfold slowly for the viewer, like a film playing in reverse, peeling back layers of performance. She also added portraits of herself, not staged ones, candid shots she had taken with a timer, showing her reading, staring out a window, brushing her hair in a mirror, alone, real. She wanted the audience to see not just what was broken, but who had survived. By Thursday, she had everything ready. The prints were boxed, the gallery layout was finalized, the invitation list was complete. That night, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Ethan mentioned a client dinner. He said it casually, between bites of roasted chicken. Lauren nodded, her face neutral. She said she had plans of her own. A colleague had invited her out. Ethan smiled faintly, then checked his phone. A message flashed briefly on the screen. Lauren didn't look. She didn't need to. She already knew. Friday approached with the stealth of a predator, each day measured in calculated movements, every hour a deliberate step closer to the edge of something irrevocable. Lauren felt it in her bones, in the taut lines of her shoulders, in the focused stillness that had overtaken her waking life. If Ethan noticed the change in her, he said nothing. Perhaps he mistook her quiet for distraction. Perhaps he thought she was busy with her exhibit. He wasn't wrong. In the days since confirming the affair, Lauren had immersed herself in the precision of execution. Her grief had not vanished. It had been distilled into something sharper, cleaner, something she could control. It was not a scream, not even a cry, but a razor-thin thread of resolve that wove through every breath she took. She wasn't preparing for confrontation. She was constructing a performance, a gallery of truth curated not in vengeance, but in revelation. The photographs were printed on thick matte paper, edges razor clean. She handled each one with care, placing them into acid-free sleeves, labeling them on the back in fine pencil. She had divided the narrative into 3 thematic arcs. The first, the ideal. These images portrayed families laughing on porches, tangled limbs of parents and children, wrinkled hands clasped across generations. A romanticized reality, bathed in morning light, everything soft and golden. The second arc, the distance. Here, the compositions grew colder, the subjects more distant in the frame, smiles strained or absent, bodies turned subtly away from one another. In this section, Lauren included her own family, photos from the lake house weekend and earlier holidays. The viewers would see what she had once failed to, the tiny fissures that presaged collapse. The third and final arc she titled The Frame. These were the photos and video stills that captured Ethan and Samantha in their moments of stolen intimacy. Lauren had selected them with care, not the most salacious, not the most obvious, but the ones that told the clearest story to anyone willing to truly look. A hand brushing a shoulder, an angled body leaning toward another, an expression too tender to be professional. In one image, Samantha laughed with her head thrown back while Ethan watched her with eyes that had long since forgotten Lauren existed. That one she enlarged to nearly 3 feet wide. The layout was precise. Visitors would be drawn in by the warmth and familiarity of the first section. They would begin to feel unease in the second. And by the time they reached the third, realization would dawn like slow-breaking thunder. Lauren also included herself. Her portrait would be the final image, a black and white self-portrait taken in her studio the night after she sent the letter to Daniel Monroe. In it, she sat in profile, her face turned toward the light, expression unreadable, eyes open but unreachable. She called it Witness. Beyond the exhibit, other preparations moved forward. The hotel room was reserved, a corner suite at the Grand Meridian, directly across from Aria. She had walked past it earlier in the week, noting the valet stand, the reflective glass panels, the soft glow of its lobby chandeliers. It would be where she slept that night, after everything was revealed. She couldn't stomach the idea of sharing a roof with Ethan for even one more night after Friday. Clothing came next. She visited a boutique downtown, one she hadn't entered in years, and allowed herself the luxury of time. The sales associate offered dresses in soft blues and creams, but Lauren gravitated toward a deep navy sheath. Simple, elegant, architectural. It fit her like armor. She paired it with a pair of red-soled heels she'd owned for years, but rarely worn. A gift from Ethan he had later told her were a bit much for you. She would wear them now, not for him, for herself. The gallery curator had approved the new concept with cautious excitement. "It's bold," she said over the phone. "Very vulnerable. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Lauren had replied. "It's the only story I have left to tell." Invitations went out on Wednesday, a formal list of guests from the university, clients of Ethan's restaurant, gallery patrons, artists, and friends. Ethan knew of the event, but seemed to assume he would see the exhibit for the first time alongside the crowd. He had even offered to give a short speech on behalf of their family, suggesting it might lend warmth to the opening. Lauren had declined, gently but firmly. "I'd rather the work speak for itself," she said. The final name on the list was Daniel Monroe. His wife's betrayal mirrored Lauren's own, though he had no idea yet. He had accepted her invitation with courteous efficiency. His assistant emailed back within hours, confirming the reservation at Aria for Friday at 8 p.m. "Mr. Monroe is pleased to accept," the note read. "He is honored by the invitation and looks forward to the conversation." Lauren had printed the email and tucked it into her journal. She wasn't proud of what she was about to do, but she didn't feel ashamed either. There was no moral satisfaction in this unraveling. There was only necessity. She called Aria one last time to confirm the table arrangement. The maitre d' remembered her voice, acknowledged the request. Yes, the table would be placed adjacent to the private booths, including the one reserved under Ethan's name. No, the parties would not be made aware of each other's presence. Yes, they could be seated within sight lines if that was her preference. It was. On Thursday night, Lauren and Ethan had dinner in near silence. The children were at their grandmother's, giving her space to prepare for the exhibit. Ethan scrolled through his phone between bites of takeout. He offered an occasional comment about a menu update at the restaurant, a new wine shipment, the possibility of opening a second location. She nodded, listening without listening. At one point, he asked if she was nervous about the opening. She smiled and said she was ready. He didn't notice the difference in her tone. He rarely did anymore. After dinner, she excused herself to pack. In the privacy of her closet, she laid out the navy dress, the heels, the pearl earrings Ethan had given her on their 10th anniversary. She ran her fingers over them slowly, remembering how much that anniversary had meant to her. He had forgotten it that morning, then covered with a dinner reservation and the earrings he'd picked up on the way home. She had forgiven him, of course. Back then, she still believed in forgetting the small things for the sake of the larger good. She packed deliberately, a weekend bag with clothes for the next 3 days, her camera, a hardcover book, her favorite tea. She placed it in her car trunk beneath a blanket. No one would notice. That night, she stood in the bathroom while Ethan showered, watching her reflection in the mirror. She looked calm, not serene, not unbothered, but composed. Something in her had realigned. The woman in the mirror no longer sought validation in Ethan's approval. She no longer feared the breaking of what had already shattered. She breathed slowly, steadily, until the water stopped running and Ethan's footsteps sounded behind her. She stepped aside without a word. Friday morning dawned overcast and cool. Lauren, dressed in jeans and a blazer for the gallery setup, tying her hair back. She arrived early and worked with the staff to arrange the prints. The space came alive slowly, white walls absorbing each frame with reverence. By mid-afternoon, it was ready. She stood in the center of the final room, surrounded by the images that told her story. The ones of Ethan and Samantha were printed without names, no labels beyond brief phrases. Complicity, blind spot, elsewhere. It was enough. Anyone who knew them would understand. Anyone who didn't would feel the betrayal without needing details. The truth, once revealed, required no embellishment. She returned home to shower and change, timing her exit so that Ethan wouldn't see her leave. By 6:30, she was at the hotel. The room was spacious and quiet, with windows that overlooked the restaurant across the street. She sipped water and watched the street below, counting cars, noting the slow rhythm of the evening. At 7:30, she made her way downstairs and walked the short distance to Arya. The maitre d' greeted her with a conspiratorial nod. "Your table is ready, Miss Bennett." "Thank you," she replied, her voice smooth as glass. He led her to a small table near the back, slightly elevated, with a clear view of the private booths. She settled into the seat facing the entrance, ordered a martini, and waited. Ethan arrived first, just after 7:45. He looked polished, relaxed, his best suit freshly pressed. He smiled at the hostess and was led to the booth with the confidence of a man who believed himself unseen. Lauren's heart did not quicken. Her hands did not tremble. She simply watched. Samantha arrived 10 minutes later, wrapped in red silk and confidence. They embraced like lovers who no longer cared if anyone noticed. She slid into the booth beside him, their knees touching, their heads bending toward one another with a familiarity Lauren now recognized in her bones. The maitre d' approached Lauren's table. "Your guest has arrived, madam." She turned, and there was Daniel Monroe, dressed in a charcoal blazer, his expression open and pleasant. He offered his hand with polite curiosity. "Miss Bennett," he said, "a pleasure." Lauren smiled. "Likewise." They were led to their table, just close enough for what needed to happen next. The soft hum of conversation filled the air at Arya, accompanied by the gentle clink of silverware and the muffled hiss of wine being poured. Candlelight flickered on white linen, throwing golden shadows across the dark wood paneling. The restaurant exuded intimacy, privacy by design, and tonight it played host to something far more fragile than romance or indulgence. It was the stage for a quiet reckoning. Lauren sat across from Daniel Monroe, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. He was easy to talk to, thoughtful, articulate, without arrogance. Their conversation began with professional courtesies, his architectural projects, her photography lectures, the future of interdisciplinary art. But there was a tension beneath the surface, a current of energy too focused to be coincidence. Lauren noticed the way his eyes occasionally shifted, scanning the room with mild curiosity. He hadn't seen them yet. She kept her face open, polite, nodded at the right moments, smiled when appropriate, but her gaze drifted again and again to the booth a few feet away, where her husband sat leaning in toward Samantha, his hand now resting casually on the table beside hers. Their fingers touched, then linked. Lauren watched as they laughed softly, their heads bending together in a moment that had once belonged only to her. Daniel was telling a story about a sustainable housing development in Olympia, his voice measured and even. Lauren forced her eyes away from the booth and back to him, trying to concentrate. He had a kind face, lines at the corners of his eyes, a mouth that didn't quite settle into a frown even when serious. He spoke with conviction, not the performative kind she had grown so used to, but the quiet confidence of someone who believed in what he did. As he spoke, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Samantha was standing, excusing herself from the booth. She walked toward the back of the restaurant, likely to the restroom, her posture easy, her smile content. Lauren's heart began to beat a little faster. This was the moment she hadn't rehearsed but had anticipated with every fiber of her being. She looked at Daniel. "Would you excuse me for just a moment?" He rose as she did, ever the gentleman, and she offered a grateful nod before making her way toward the corridor. The hallway was narrow, lined with photographs of celebrity patrons and vintage wine labels. Lauren stopped near the corner, waiting. When Samantha appeared, they both froze. Recognition sparked instantly. Samantha's eyes widened, her body stiffening as though bracing for impact. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, suspended in time. "You're James's wife," Samantha said finally, her voice low and brittle. Lauren tilted her head slightly. "And you're Michael's." Samantha glanced over her shoulder instinctively, as if someone might rescue her, then looked back at Lauren. "Please, not here." Lauren's voice remained calm. "Why not? You seem to enjoy this place." Samantha reached out, her manicured hand closing gently around Lauren's forearm. "I can explain." Lauren didn't flinch. She stepped back, removing the hand with the slow, deliberate care. "Can you explain why you've been sleeping with my husband? Can you explain why you're sitting in a private booth with him while your husband is 20 feet away at my table?" Samantha paled. Her carefully applied lipstick seemed suddenly garish, too bright against her drained skin. Her voice wavered. "It's complicated." "It always is," Lauren replied. Behind Samantha, movement caught her eye. Ethan had risen from his seat, his gaze locked on them. His face registered confusion, then panic. He hesitated, then took a step forward. Lauren turned slightly, acknowledging him with nothing more than a glance. He opened his mouth, but she spoke first. Having dinner, just like you." His words faltered. "This isn't what it looks like. I think we're well past that line." Daniel appeared then, concern on his face. "Lauren, everything all right?" He looked from Lauren to Samantha, then to Ethan, who stood rigidly beside the booth. Lauren's voice softened. "Daniel, I'd like you to meet my husband, Ethan Bennett." Daniel blinked. His gaze shifted from Lauren to Ethan, then slowly to Samantha. "And I believe you know Samantha." The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel's expression changed, disbelief giving way to something more visceral. His features twisted in recognition, then pain, then something deeper and harder. "Claire," he said, his voice cracking on her name. "How long?" No one answered. No one needed to. Lauren stood still, watching the devastation she had summoned take root in real time. She had imagined this moment so many times, thought it would bring satisfaction, closure. But instead, she felt only sorrow. A deep, human ache, not for Ethan or Samantha, but for the man beside her whose world had just been shattered. "We should go somewhere more private," Lauren said at last. The maitre d', quick to assess the growing tension, stepped forward with the grace of someone trained in discretion. "Perhaps the private dining room, madam." Lauren nodded. Yes, that would be fine. He led them to a quiet room at the back of the restaurant, away from the prying eyes and murmurs that had begun to ripple through the dining area. A table for 4 was quickly set, menus discreetly placed, doors gently closed. They sat opposite one another, Ethan and Samantha on one side, Lauren and Daniel on the other. The symmetry felt deliberate, the division symbolic. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan finally broke the silence. "How did you find out?" Lauren's gaze didn't waver. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not," he muttered. Daniel stared at his wife. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Samantha's mascara had begun to smudge. She shook her head slightly. "I don't know." "That's the problem with affairs," Lauren said, her voice cool. "They live in a world without consequences until reality catches up." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You're being very calm." "What did you expect?" she asked. "That I would throw my drink in your face? Create a scene so you could paint me as unhinged?" His face flushed. "Of course not. I've had 3 days," she continued, "to watch you lie to my face, to see if anything would change. It didn't." Samantha's head snapped up. "You've known for 3 days?" "Yes. And in those 3 days, neither of you noticed a thing." Ethan opened his mouth, but Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp. 3 days? And you still went through with this dinner?" "I needed you to see it," Lauren said simply. A knock at the door. A waiter entered with a carafe of water and a bread basket. The room fell into polite silence as he placed them on the table and retreated. Ethan shifted forward. "Lauren, I didn't want to hurt you." Daniel laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Then why sleep with my wife?" "No, don't," Daniel cut him off. "Don't say it was a mistake. Don't insult us with that." Lauren reached into her purse and placed a keycard on the table. "I'm staying at the Meridian tonight." Ethan stared at it. "You're leaving?" "No, you are. I'll be at the gallery tomorrow. You can come by the house while I'm gone. Take what you need." He looked stricken. "You're throwing me out?" "No," Lauren said. "You did that when you chose her." Samantha's voice was barely audible. "What happens now?" Lauren met her eyes. "That depends on you. But whatever it is, it won't involve pretending anymore." She turned to Daniel. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this." Daniel nodded slowly, still in shock. "So am I. But I'd rather know." Lauren stood. "We're done here." Ethan rose too. "We need to talk, Lauren, privately." She looked at him. "You had months for private. This is truth, and it belongs in the light." Without another word, she left the room. The air outside was cooler now, the wind off the water brisk and clean. She stepped into it without hesitation, her heels clicking on the pavement, her breath steady. Across the street, the Grand Meridian's entrance glowed softly. She walked toward it, the city humming around her. Inside the room, she set down her bag and removed the earrings. She undressed slowly, methodically, folding the dress with care before placing it back in her garment bag. She poured herself a glass of water, sat by the window, and stared out at the skyline. The lights blurred in her vision. Then the tears came. Not polite ones, not cinematic streaks down her cheeks, but the deep, racking sobs of a woman who had been holding up the sky for too long. She cried until her lungs burned, until her body gave in to the weight of it all, until the sobs turned to silence. When the knock came at her door, she was still in the chair, wrapped in the hotel's robe, her face streaked and raw. She looked through the peephole. Daniel stood on the other side, his face pale, eyes red. She opened the door. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said, and he did. The silence that followed their night at Aria was not immediate. In the hours after Daniel stepped into her hotel room, the space filled with the quiet sounds of shared devastation, whispers too low to carry weight, long pauses stretched between confessions, and the occasional, unsteady laughter that came only when tears had dried and the body sought release in something less unbearable. They had not made love, nor touched beyond the occasional brush of fingers or the shared fold of a blanket pulled over shaking shoulders. Their bodies sat side by side in two chairs angled toward the window, facing the city like two survivors surveying the aftermath of a flood. Words flowed not as conversation, but as fragments of thought, half-finished memories, quiet admissions, unspoken realizations. It was not solace they found in each other, but recognition. Lauren watched the city drift from night into morning. Fog rolled slowly over the bay, muting the skyline and smearing the lights into smudges of gold and gray. Her skin felt raw from weeping, her throat thick, her eyes swollen and hollow. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something cleaner, almost sacred, a sense that truth, as painful as it had finally been spoken. And in its wake, the silence felt earned. Daniel left at dawn. He had not slept, but neither of them had. He stood slowly, his limbs stiff from sitting too long, and looked down at her with an expression both tentative and kind. She walked him to the door without words. There was nothing left to explain. Just before he stepped into the hallway, he looked back, his voice rough. "Thank you for telling me." Lauren nodded. "You deserved to know." He lingered for one more moment, then was gone. She stood in the doorway long after he'd disappeared down the hall, her hand resting on the frame as if to steady herself against a new kind of gravity. Eventually, she turned back into the room, washed her face, changed clothes, and packed her things with quiet precision. She left the hotel by 8, the streets still half asleep, the air cool with the weight of early September. The world had shifted. She had shifted. When she arrived home, the house was silent. Ethan's car was gone. She stepped inside slowly, as if crossing a threshold into a space she no longer recognized. The air held that strange, still quality of absence. She walked through the living room, her footsteps muffled against the rug, her fingers brushing the back of the couch, the corner of a picture frame. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. The photos on the mantel mocked her now, smiling faces frozen in time, unaware of the rot beneath their surface. She made tea, not because she wanted it, but because her body needed something routine. She sat at the kitchen island, staring at the empty chair where Ethan often scrolled through emails while sipping his first cup of coffee. He wouldn't be coming back here, not today, not ever in the same way. The keys she had placed in his hand before leaving the restaurant the night before had been symbolic, but they were also practical. She had changed the codes to the security system. She had called a locksmith that morning. The locks would be replaced by Monday. At 10 o'clock, her phone rang. She knew it would be him before she even glanced at the screen. She let it ring until it stopped. It rang again 5 minutes later. And again. On the fourth call, she answered. "Lauren, please. Are you alone?" "Yes." "Good. Then you can listen." He began to speak, but she interrupted. "You don't need to tell me how sorry you are. I know that already. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry for the scene. But I've seen the messages, Ethan. I've read your plans, the trips, the apartment. This wasn't a mistake. This was a life you were building outside of ours." He stammered. "It wasn't real. It was enough to last a year," she said quietly. "It was enough to lie to me in my own home night after night. I ended it." She almost laughed. "You ended it after I exposed it. That's not regret. That's damage control." There was a long pause. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you gone. By Sunday night, take what you need. We'll handle the rest with lawyers. Our kids, I'll talk to them when the time comes, and you'll talk to them with honesty. If you lie to them, I will tell them the truth myself." "Lauren, I'm done, Ethan. Not just with the affair, with the excuses, with the man I thought you were." She hung up. The stillness that followed was not comforting. It was vast. She sat there for nearly an hour, unmoving. Her tea grew cold. Outside, the neighborhood bustled through a typical Saturday, unaware that a family was unraveling behind the tidy, hedge-lined house. Later that day, she received a message from the gallery. The exhibit had been a success. Reviews were already appearing online, most praising the raw honesty of the final section. Patrons had lingered in the last room, some weeping, some speechless. One reviewer wrote, "Lauren Bennett's family portrait is not merely an exhibit, it's an excavation of truth beneath the veneer of domestic perfection. It's fearless, devastating, and necessary." She turned off her phone and wept again, not for Ethan, not for Samantha, but for herself, for the woman who had spent years making peace with less, who had bartered her instincts for comfort, who had stayed loyal to a man who had long since left their marriage in spirit. On Sunday, Ethan came to collect his things. She left the house before he arrived, not out of cruelty, but because she couldn't bear to see him pack pieces of their life into cardboard boxes. She returned in the evening to find his car gone, his closet half empty, the office shelves lighter. There was a note on the kitchen table. She didn't read it. The days that followed were a blur of logistics and emotion. She called a lawyer. She met with an accountant. She made lists. She had long conversations with her sister, who offered to come stay with her, and with her oldest friend in Chicago, who cried over the phone and offered unfiltered rage on her behalf. But it was Daniel's voice that she heard most clearly in the days that followed, not because he said the right things, but because he said so little. He sent a message 3 days after their dinner. "I haven't responded to Claire. I don't know if I ever will, but thank you for showing me. Thank you for giving me truth, not fantasy. They began writing to each other often. Emails at first, then texts. Nothing romantic, just pieces of thought, articles they found interesting, quotes, anecdotes. They didn't speak again in person for nearly 2 weeks. When they finally met for coffee, it was at a small place tucked away near the sculpture park, quiet and hidden. They sat outside under a faded umbrella, the September air cool and damp. He looked thinner, older somehow, his eyes darker. But when he smiled, it was genuine. "Are you surviving?" she asked. "Barely. You?" "Somehow." They talked for hours, about their kids, about the logistics of separation, about the unexpected grief of losing something already broken. There was no plan to their conversation, no structure, just the relief of not having to pretend. At home, Lauren resumed her work. She began photographing again, smaller projects at first, intimate portraits of older couples, single parents, families choosing to live together in non-traditional ways. The stories were more important to her now than the aesthetics. She sought authenticity, not beauty. Her students noticed the change. So did her colleagues. Ethan, meanwhile, did not go quietly. He alternated between pleading and bitterness. He sent long emails at night, tried to argue that they could rebuild, tried to paint the affair as an exception. But Lauren never responded. She didn't owe him that anymore. Samantha left the city. Rumors floated through mutual friends. She had moved to Portland. She had taken a leave of absence. She had lost several clients. No one reached out to Lauren for clarification. The silence spoke for itself. The children asked questions. Ella, sharper than her years, had already sensed the shift. Zach cried the first night he stayed at Ethan's apartment. Lauren answered their questions with care and honesty. She did not use blame. She used facts. They deserved that. The weeks became months. Papers were filed. Accounts were divided. Lauren kept the house. Ethan kept the restaurant. They communicated only through legal channels and family schedules. It was cleaner that way. One evening in late November, as rain pressed against the windows and wind swept through the backyard trees, Lauren sat at her kitchen table and wrote in her journal. Her handwriting was slower now, more deliberate. She wrote about silence, about the shape of loneliness, about the odd freedom that came from letting go of something she had once clung to with both hands. And then she wrote about Daniel. Not as a future, not as a savior, but as a witness, someone who had seen the same ugliness she had, who had walked through fire and not turned away. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, the not knowing didn't scare her. Winter settled over Seattle in slow, quiet folds, draping the city in mist and breathy drizzle. Mornings arrived with reluctant light, the sun barely pushing past the thick gray sky, and evenings came early, swallowing the streets in fog before the clock struck 5. The days moved with a strange clarity now, unhurried but purposeful, and Lauren, for the first time in years, found herself walking through them not as an actor in someone else's production, but as the architect of her own story. The house no longer felt haunted. The air had shifted. Ethan's presence, once so embedded in the creaking of floorboards and the scent on pillows, had faded to something ghost-like, intangible. She had rearranged the living room, repainted the walls of the bedroom in a cooler tone, and filled the spaces he had once occupied with things that nourished her: books, plants, framed prints by artists she admired but had never indulged in. Even the light seemed to fall differently now, unfiltered by the expectations she had once shouldered like a second skin. Ella adapted quickly, or at least appeared to. She was still a teenager, closed off in many ways, resistant to too much affection or too many questions, but her gaze had softened toward Lauren in recent weeks. There was respect there now, not born of fear or discipline, but of something deeper. Zach struggled more openly. He cried on alternating nights, sometimes about Ethan, sometimes about the dog having to split time between two homes, but even he began to settle into the new rhythm. Children had a way of finding footing, even on uneven ground. Lauren didn't hide the truth from them. She didn't villainize Ethan, but she didn't protect him either. She explained that relationships were built on trust, and when that trust was broken, healing sometimes meant letting go. They didn't always understand, but they listened. And that was enough. Her exhibit at the Cascadia Modern remained the subject of conversation long after its closing. It had been extended twice, and eventually featured in a national photography journal, with one critic calling it a seismic shift in the landscape of domestic portraiture. She received dozens of emails from strangers, some expressing admiration, others gratitude, and some sharing their own stories of betrayal and reinvention. Each message affirmed something she hadn't even realized she needed to hear, that her pain had meant something, that it had spoken for others too. She started teaching again in January, returning to her classroom with a calm authority that hadn't existed before. Her students, once wary of her precision, now responded with engagement. She noticed their questions grew bolder, their critiques more thoughtful. They saw her not just as a professor, but as a working artist, someone who had dared to put her life into her work without flinching. And then there was Daniel. They didn't rush anything. After their night at Aria, after the letters and coffee meetings and long silences that neither found awkward, they began seeing each other quietly, without definition or expectation. Their bond was unspoken, not because it lacked depth, but because it was rooted in something they both understood couldn't be forced. They were not two halves seeking to become whole. They were two whole people learning how to walk side by side again. They met often, but without a pattern, sometimes for lunch, sometimes for a late-night walk. They discussed books, their work, how their children were adjusting. He showed her designs for a new project he was leading downtown, a sustainable housing initiative with an emphasis on community spaces. She invited him to a guest lecture she gave on photographic ethics. He sat in the back, took notes, and afterward told her she had changed how he saw light. She laughed, then cried that night, not because of the compliment, but because she believed it. One evening, 6 months after Aria, they walked along the waterfront, the setting sun painting the water in molten amber. The air was cool but pleasant, and the smell of the bay mingled with roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. Daniel reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Neither of them said anything for several minutes. "I never thanked you properly," he said finally. "For what?" "For not looking away, for having the courage to see it, and show it." Lauren looked out over the water, her expression unreadable. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like desperation. Maybe they're not so different. She turned toward him, studying his face in the fading light. "Would you have stayed with her if I hadn't told you?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. Maybe. That's what scares me. I trusted her so completely, I would have made excuses for years. We all do, until we can't." He nodded, then stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face him fully now. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought for a long time before answering. "Not always. I still miss what I thought I had. Sometimes I miss the routine, even the illusion, but mostly, I'm grateful. For the truth? She nodded. Even when it broke me. He squeezed her hand gently. You rebuilt. So did you. A week later, they went hiking outside the city, a trail Lauren had walked alone in the early days after Ethan moved out. This time, the path felt different. Not because the terrain had changed, but because she no longer felt like she was escaping something. They reached the summit in silence, the view expansive, the city a hazy sprawl below them. She sat on a rock and pulled out her camera, capturing Daniel from behind as he looked out at the skyline. You're still framing things, he said without turning around. Always? Spring arrived, slow and damp, washing the streets clean of winter. Lauren spent more time in her garden, planting lavender and rosemary, tearing out the dying things and starting fresh. Her hands grew calloused, her nails dirty, and for the first time in a long while, she welcomed the ache in her back at the end of the day. It meant something was growing. She ran into Ethan unexpectedly at a colleague's retirement party in April. He looked thinner, older. They exchanged pleasantries, carefully curated, polite. At one point, he pulled her aside, his voice low. I never properly apologized. You did, she replied. Not really. I was too busy trying to save face. I understand now what I lost. She didn't respond at first. Then, with genuine calm, she said, I hope you find your version of peace. He nodded. You seem to have found yours. She followed his gaze to where Daniel stood across the room, talking with one of her faculty friends. She looked back at Ethan. I'm building something new, day by day. That night, walking home beneath a canopy of stars, Daniel slipped his arm around her waist. They didn't speak for a long time. The air was warm, the scent of lilacs drifting through the darkness. What are you thinking about? He asked softly. How the worst night of my life somehow brought me here. He looked down at her. You regret it? No. I regret the years I spent believing in something that wasn't real, but not this. Not now. They reached her front gate. She unlocked it slowly, savoring the quiet. Before stepping inside, she turned back to him. Sometimes, she said, you have to lose everything to find what you actually need. He smiled. I'm glad you reserved that table next to ours. So am I. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a gentle finality. Upstairs, the bedroom was bathed in moonlight. She crossed to her dresser and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath old notebooks and tucked-away scarves, was a photograph she had taken in the first year of her marriage, a candid image of Ethan laughing, holding Ella as a baby. She stared at it for a moment. Then she tore it in half, dropped it into the waste bin, and closed the drawer. Outside, the city slept. Inside, Lauren did not. She was awake, more awake than she had ever been, and tomorrow there would be more work to do, not the labor of surviving, but the craft of becoming. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss new ones. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. You won't want to miss them. And if this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.